Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. We're discussing national political news of the day. And today we want to discuss the Voting Rights Act. It's been in the news a lot over the past decade because it has been gutted in several respects by the conservative Supreme Court, which just absolutely hates the thing, even though Republicans love to talk about how they voted for it, or that their predecessors, their party voted for it. But it has been cut back on a number of different ways. States don't have to are no longer having to make reports and have direct compliance. A number of other ways that this has gone down. But right now, what's at stake is that the Voting Rights Act allows for private citizens to file lawsuits if their rights to vote or voting privileges, if they're deemed that, have been abridged in any way. And what the Republicans are hoping to do in a lawsuit that started in Arkansas and is not being heard by the appellate court of the Eighth Circuit, but is probably going straightly to the Supreme Court. And what this would do was it would eliminate the right of private persons to file lawsuits in the Voting Rights Act. And that way only state attorney generals could file such suits. The problem with that is that if you're in certain states where they don't like the Voting Rights Act, it's not going to happen. And even now, probably attorney general lawsuits make up about 10% of the lawsuits. 90% are filed by private citizens. So this would greatly reduce the ability of voting rights to be maintained in the courts. And again, Voting Rights Act was passed in order to take us out of Jim Crow and to allow freedom and equality of voting rights across the board, got rid of poll taxes, all this kind of things. But right now we've got, maps, a Supreme Court decision in Alabama that the state is refusing to honor, and in a map that was determined to have violated the Voting Rights Act. And again, there's no way that the Alabama Attorney General would have filed that lawsuit, not in a million years. So that was done by private people. This is very concerning because if there's no mechanism, we're going to be depending on basically on the good faith of anybody who's in government to not want to misuse their power to rig the elections. Dave, what do you got to say?
This is really fascinating how this has developed. I remember seeing something back in November where there was talk of how this was such a big decision in the Eighth Circuit. And then, I guess the Eighth Circuit Appellate Court has decided they were just going to let the decision stand. And I appreciate the background that you provided, but as I kind of dug a little bit deeper, an organization called Democracy Docket, and there some others have written extensively about this. It really is nothing short of a radical remake of the Voting Rights Act, and to a certain extent, it's difficult for people to understand the magnitude. When this was crafted back in '65. If that was really the case, that only the attorneys general of the states or of the federal government could bring these cases, they just simply don't have the resources. Or in many cases, the inclination to do so. So like you had mentioned, would Georgia, half the states are sort of run by Republican legislatures and governors. Would those secretaries of state bring these cases? And if you look back at the, 60 years of legacy of the Voting Rights Act, No, in many cases they would not have, like I said, in part out of sort of general principle, in part out of resources. So fast forward to today, if private people who are aggrieved or who think that their rights have been impugned, if they try to make a case, typically now what happens is they'll go to some advocacy organization to file suit on their behalf. They don't go to the Attorney General's office of the state or the Justice Department to say, hey, I'm a lone person who thinks I've been aggrieved. Please validate my rights. It's usually people that specialize and find these cases. So is this really, like I said, it's really a pretty radical revision to the scope of the law. And I'll say one more thing, and then I'll hand it back to you. Mm-hmm. This is the Eighth Circuit. So just to be clear, it's 7 states: Arkansas, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota. And so that's currently the law of the land there. But you've got the other, basically, there's 13 total circuits, but really one is a specialty circuit and one is D.C. So let's just say the other 11 jurisdictions don't currently have this as their understanding, because every case that's been decided for 60 years has taken this as the status quo. NAACP's legal branch, they are often involved, among other advocacy groups. So we've got this mismatch, and even now what's happened is, and I don't mean to impugn Republicans per se, but this is really their strategy in these states. So we're seeing that the Fifth Circuit, so Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, I believe it's Louisiana. There's a pending case right now. Yeah, it's Louisiana, where they're saying, hey, look, we can't go on with this split. It's not fair to any of the parties involved. So look at the Eighth Circuit. We should do that here in the Fifth. So there's like almost 100% chance the Supreme Court has to step in and really hear this.
Yeah, although the ACLU is not even saying whether it's going to bother. They're the ones behind the suit. And I want to be real clear here as to what the nature of this ruling is. It was Circuit Judge David Strauss, a Trump appointee, in the majority opinion, joined by Judge Raymond Gruender, an appointment. There was a appointee of former President George Bush. Circuit Judge Levansky Smith, another Bush appointee, dissented. Said this is ridiculous. But the key point to this decision is, for much of the last half century, courts have assumed that Section 2 is privately enforceable. A deeper look has revealed that this assumption rests on flimsy footing. So basically, I mean, we're talking about every decision that's been made in favor of the Voting Rights Act, in theory, could be revisited. Because, I mean, every one that wasn't brought by an attorney general. But it makes absolutely no sense that an attorney general in a state that is known for wanting to basically suppress the black vote, as it is currently doing in Alabama, Arkansas, and Louisiana, that the attorney general's, out of the goodness of his heart, is going to file the suit. That's just not going to happen. That the attorney general is usually part of the problem. So it's insane that the Voting Rights Act would have been interpreted that way, because it renders it basically useless, except in states that are already compliant. I mean, it's just the biggest irony in the world. So, but the fact that the Supreme Court just got such a goofy majority, although they did rule on the Alabama map for all the good it's done. But to basically make some common sense here. Why would this act have been passed if there was no way to enforce it?
Yeah, exactly that. And I came across, in looking into this, for today, I came across a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg from the Shelby versus Holder case, where it was the pre-approval component of the Voting Rights Act, where former, Confederate states that had a historic track record of discrimination, And we could talk about some of that if you'd like,
Yeah.
but the track record speaks for itself, to be honest. So what the ruling in Shelby was that no longer was pre-approval necessary to change your state level voting laws, because there wasn't, apparently their claim was that there was not sufficient evidence that it was necessary anymore, that we had evolved as a country beyond the need to protect voting rights. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg's famous quote, which I think is really telling, is throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's I mean, that's a really good, but then we really need to understand that the agenda isn't to correct anything. The agenda is basically to bury the Voting Rights Act. And that could have repercussions everywhere. A lot of states have the protections already in place. Although Ohio had it and its Supreme Court ruled against its map, and the Republicans are ignoring their Supreme Court ruling. I mean, the party of just doesn't feel like it has to abide by court rulings. And again, this is something that we haven't really seen since Andrew Jackson, where they can just deliberately ignore a ruling and just deny that they're doing it. I mean, it was a lot like Russia invading Crimea and denying they were doing it, right? I mean, the hubris is way out of there. But again, this, in theory, it could lead to something called a poll tax again, or something that works like a poll tax. They just won't call it a poll tax. I mean, there's other things that they can do, and people will say, well, no, that can't happen anymore. I mean, and the point is, maybe the country has evolved to a certain extent, but these states haven't. They're showing us right now that they haven't, that they have not. And their excuse is, they say, well, we have political motivations, not racial motivations. It's like, well, the political motivation is to suppress the black vote. That was always a political motivation because you didn't like how they were going to vote. But and this is, again, cases we've discussed on this show where they've been gerrymandered to make to jam all of the black vote, or at least a good portion of it, into one district, so that the black vote is not reflected in the proportion of the congressional and state and legislatures. In Alabama, the thing looks like an octopus. In Louisiana, it looks like a snake connecting the two major cities into one. It's ridiculous, but it looks like it's going to be allowed if the Supreme Court doesn't overturn this.
So before we go to the Supreme Court kind of getting a sense of what they may decide, I think it's important to point out this is not happening in a vacuum. In fact, like I talked about with Shelby, which was, obviously many years ago at this point, there's been an onslaught of a coordinated attack on the Voting Rights Act, nipping around the edges about not just who qualifies, but other details, like, for example, if there is a discrepancy between the Voting Rights Act requirement for an absentee voter and what a state law has on the books. So, for example, I move from one state to the next. As soon as I've left my origin home, I'm no longer eligible to vote there. But if I happen to move too close to the deadline to register for an absentee ballot in the next state that I've moved into, the destination state, the Voting Rights Act tries to accommodate those folks by giving them as much time as possible within reason to be able to vote in their new state. But there's a fight on saying if there's a difference, we should err on the side of the state, not the Voting Rights Act. So it's a really small technicality, but that's the type of legal challenges that are happening. And I'll just mention one more. In the Fifth Circuit, there's a decision where the Circuit Court actually did find that there was discrimination in a particular map that was drawn. And it's a really conservative court, so they pushed it back, and they actually used language that said what happened in this redistricting was not typical. It was stark and it was jarring. And these commissioners transformed, I'm paraphrasing the decision, they transformed what was the highest percentage of Black and Latino residents in that district to the lowest. And the finding was based on the fact that you could look at these two groups, people of color, together and say that it was targeted based on race. So what they've found now is there's a process underway to say, well, you can't lump one aggrieved group with another aggrieved group because they've got different histories. So therefore what the court found was probably misguided. So they're taking a different attack at the ability for people to raise claims. We started the show by talking about one approach, which is, but this is a different approach. So I'm just getting at that they're really nipping around the edges, but this case that we talked about, Supreme Court, is right to the heart.
The Mueller report, I wish, covered the oranges, how it started. In the failing New York Times by an anonymous, gutless coward. They sacrifice every day for the furniture, future of their children. I know words. I have the best words. Yosemites. Voter ID to buy a loaf of bread. The Democrats. Ooh, there was a mosquito. I don't want mosquitoes around me. I'm a very stable genius. Disinfectant, where it knocks it out in 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection? I tested positively for negative, right? People are flushing toilets 10 times, 15 times, as opposed to once. Turn on the sink, the water comes out. No, get those lights off! Off! One of the wettest we've ever seen from the standpoint of water. The United States.
So there are concerns about the mental health and cognitive issues of a presidential candidate. Of course, we've been hearing all about President Biden. We've seen him kind of wander around the stage as if he was confused, sometimes forgetting who he's talking about in his speeches and the rest. But now questions are being raised about another presidential candidate, and he's always given rambling speeches, but they seem to be worse than ever. And he's pulled Biden in confusing Nancy Pelosi with referring to Nancy Pelosi when he actually was referring to Nikki Haley. I guess it's a woman. I guess, strong women are, he just kind of confuses them all. It's hard to say. But at any rate, we've got this happening. We've got him starting. He's under a lot of pressure, obviously. I mean, he could be convicted of a crime. He's now lost 3 times in court, including most recently for an $83.3 million defamation claim that could get bigger if he continues to defame her, and he doesn't seem to be able to control himself. So at any rate, there's a lot happening, and somebody, a guest on Fox News, I think it was the morning show, tried to point out that this is becoming an issue. Kayleigh McEnany, former, I think she was, what was she, the Secretary of Communication or something for Trump?
I think a communications director or something like that.
Communications director, right. So she flipped out. She just absolutely flipped out and started quoting polls. Nobody's concerned about President Trump. He passed his mental health exam, and 3/4 of the people polled say they're concerned about Biden. It's Biden. And every time the rest of the group wanted to, some of them even probably Trump supporters, wanted to bring it back to the conversation at hand, she just again flipped out. She's on several television shows flipping out because, and that, what that tells me is that she is, as somebody who is an expert in the subject, worried about a change of narrative. some of the speeches have been pretty bad, and we'll maybe talk about them a little bit later. But the question is this just typical Trump who tends to ramble anyway, or are there new issues that are raising concerns about his fitness?
So I think this is like one of those things where two things can be true at once. There's a lot of folks out there saying, hey, the media has ignored it for years. Trump has always gotten verbally confused, or he's always just, this is how he speaks. So he's been getting a pass basically for a long time, especially compared to if you watch video of him, when he was much younger, he was actually pretty articulate. So that there is an indication as a layperson that, there's been a change over time, as would be expected. But that said, it's really being raised as an issue now. I think there was like a Newsweek article where it's called Nikki Haley Sounds the Alarm was the title. And she was specifically. And that
has Trump flipping out that she would do that, because that can be a problem for him down the road.
Yeah, because that's his, the two of them are the last folks standing in the Republican primary. There was some talk, up until fairly recently that they were still aligned in many ways. But, attacking his mental acuity the way that she is, obviously they're no longer in alignment. And so she gave a quote in New Hampshire where she said, what you're dealing with, when you're dealing with the pressures of the presidency, we can't have someone else that we question whether they're mentally fit to do this. We can't. And basically she's saying look at what Biden's been doing. The Republican establishment has been trashing Biden's cognitive decline, evidence that appears, to them to be determinative in fitness, etc. And now what are we going to do? We're going to turn around and have another 80-year-old person in the same situation. Right. So just I know I think you mentioned these, but he has talked a lot recently about how he ran against and beat Barack Obama, which didn't happen. He talked about how Joe Biden's going to lead the United States into World War II. Which obviously there's already been a World War II, and that's a long time ago. He meant 3 for sure. And also, he blamed Florida Governor Jeb Bush for starting the Iraq War, when he was governor of Florida, and it's, George Bush, his brother. So, those are just small things. And honestly, in a good faith climate, you give people or environment or situation, you give people the benefit of the doubt. You allow them to make the best case for themselves, and someone who's aged makes a mental mistake of that nature, typically you give them the benefit of the doubt. But this isn't typical. This is the presidency. This is, the very, very challenging time for our country, for the world. So yeah, that's my take on it. And I'll hand over to you, and we could talk a little bit about the history maybe.
Yeah, I mean, his mental health has always been questioned.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, even before he was president. Everything from, accusing the Emmy Awards of being politicized against him and rigging that election, right into 2016, Senator Ted Cruz won the Iowa nomination, the Iowa caucuses. Trump accused him of election fraud of some sort. I don't know if they ever came up with a theory of it. And so this is the history. This is his history. And we understand that. And we understand that, a lot of people have diagnosed him as a narcissist and all of that. But it was always based on some, obsession that he couldn't give up, some pattern that he couldn't break out of. There wasn't a question of a cognitive decline or cognitive issues with him. And now that's being raised. And I'm saying right out now, Nikki Haley cannot be the VP candidate, because the Democrats will play that speech over and over and over again. So she's all in. She is still trying to win, however unlikely that is. But she's damaged him, because that takes it out. Even though a lot of MAGA people will reject her as a rhino, centrists won't. So it is now official. Whether or not it's any worse than it's been, it is now officially a campaign issue. And that's why Kayleigh McEnany was flipping out, because she knows it. And so what happens? Is it a wash? I mean, I think what Republicans would hope at that point is so many young people are so discouraged they just don't vote at all, right? Or they vote for a third party. And that is a possibility. But if Biden holds it together, maybe people will forget his moments if he doesn't have any more from here to the election. But I don't know what his state is either. None of us knows, right? We don't know. People do make mistakes. Biden has always said weird things, right? Even when he was younger, he said weird things, and so did Trump. So it's just, maybe things aren't getting any better. Are they all that much worse for either of them? Who knows? But now this is a narrative that Trump has to worry about.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a political issue, for sure. And I think it's almost like a perfect storm too, where if you look at the history, which you sort of allude to here for a minute, and then come back and say how that impacts today. So, about 7 years ago or so, according to this article that I was looking at, there was a book that, was called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, drafted by 27 leading psychologists, medical health professionals, Yale University professor Brandy Lee. They say that Trump is one of the most impulsive, arrogant, ignorant, disorganized, chaotic, nihilistic, self-contradictory, self-important, and self-serving of all world leaders. And so that's just one sort of smear. That's a long time ago. Not a lot of people took it too seriously. But now that his speech is also exhibiting patterns that show the, quote, possibility of a neurological disorder, such as dementia or Alzheimer's, that compounds the sort of the questions about his temperament to be a world leader. Now the question is capacity. So when you combine the history, where over 70,000 mental health professionals had already signed a petition saying they thought he was dangerous, and that goes against their professional typical practice. They have a commitment that they don't typically diagnose people that they've never met. Like that's part of the profession. But 70,000 people thought it was important to go public with it. When you combine that sort of assessment with the observations. So now people are now it kind of feeds into, well, what about the fact that we have Biden going against Trump, and what else is there? And that's why we're seeing 70% of the country, approximately, according to some surveys, say they don't want either candidate. And in the exit polls after New Hampshire, we saw that people that were voting Republican, about a third of them, I think, said they would consider not voting Republican if it was Trump. And now, granted, people are saying that might be based on criminal reasons, might be based on other reasons, but that leads to the fact that New Hampshire was highly represented by independents, not Republicans, as we talked about last week. So again, in the general, that's a red flag for people that think that Trump is going to walk away with it. As he's starting to trend to be more of he's leading polls nationally, but now it's in question.
Yeah, and he's been leading in polls where there are 10 to 15% people undecided. And in my view, that's bad for him, because people might not be excited about Biden, but in 2020, those voters broke for Biden in a big way. That's how he won. So Trump has to be concerned because he needs bigger leads. Like he had right about this time before the pandemic started last time around, right? So, but mental health of candidates hasn't always been effective as a campaign tool. It was raised and backfired badly in Reagan-Mondale in 1984. And the interesting thing is in retrospect, we are learning that he did have early signs of dementia due to Alzheimer's before his second term, and he was not very effective against Walter Mondale in that first debate. Now, I want to not necessarily say that's an indication of dementia, because Mondale was an incredible debater and he was aggressive and he took Reagan out of his game. They were supposed to not address each other, but then Reagan used his, well, there you go again line, and Mondale was waiting for that moment. He said, because once he has that, then he has license. The rules have been broken. And so he turned to Reagan, and Reagan had this horrified look on his face. You can see it in the cameras, and said, when you say things like this, blah, 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 and hammered on him. It was like the brightest point of Mondale's campaign. He actually picked up on some points for the first time since the Democratic convention. Unfortunately for Mondale, the second debate happened. Reagan was medicated or whatever. He was ready to go. And it wasn't Mondale, but one of the journalist panel asked him, don't you think age is an issue? And Reagan was ready for it and said, well, I'm not bringing up my opponent's youth and inexperience, right? And that was the zinger. It guaranteed the election for him. So it can backfire. And so people have to be very careful. But the benefit that Biden has that Trump doesn't have is that Nikki Haley has called on it. That's going to be a hammer from here on in. I don't know if she did it intentionally. But and there's other evidence too. Trump is not on his game completely. He's usually got very good instincts for politics. But he made a huge mistake the other night by trying to take credit for the economy. He says, oh yes, the stock market is rallying because they see me doing well in the polls. Big mistake, because he's basically confirmed that the economy is good. Right now, voters aren't convinced that the economy is good, but now he's saying that the economy is good. You saw that the Biden team jumped right on that and thanked him the same way they thanked, what's her name, Green, for her speech comparing him to FDR, right? I mean, it's just right there. And so is that another indication? Well, it wasn't a huge gaffe, and it is something that's consistent with his ego. But it was a mistake, and he doesn't usually make those kinds of mistakes. Evidence of cognitive decline, I don't know. It's not any single one of these is an indication, but it's starting to build into a narrative.
You hit the nail on the head. I know we're in the closing seconds here, but I think that's the point, is that these are cumulative observations that are going to make impressions for voters leading into the silly season. People say that people don't really pay attention until, say, September, but especially if the general election starts this early. But as these patterns of choices unfold, that narrative may actually work against his ability to draw a bright line between himself and the criticisms that Republicans project onto Joe Biden's mental acuity.
And Biden doesn't have anybody in the party accusing him of that, of saying that. At least not yet. I mean, except maybe Robert Kennedy and whatever. But again, nobody of Haley's stature. That was a big moment. And like I said, it's the narrative is effective when the voters say it is.
When the wintry winds are blowing and the snow is starting to fall, then my eyes turn westward, knowing that's the place that I love best of all. California, I've been blue since I've been away from you. I can't wait till I get going. Even now, I'm starting in to call. Oh, California, here I come, right back where I started from, where bowers of flowers bloom in the sun. Each morning at dawning, birdies sing and everything.
Finally, we return to California to discuss the Senate race. So, of course, the election here is, a little over a month away. And with the vacant Dianne Feinstein's vacant, it's not vacant. There's a appointee in there who is not running for election. You don't say re-election, you say election. But Judge Christ, his signs say re-election, but he was never elected to begin with, right? Anyways, we have a slew of candidates running. We've got 3 big name Democrats and one big name Republican and some others that are kind of big name. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I think it's time for us to start talking about what we think is going to happen. Now, of course, we have what's referred to as the jungle primary in California, where everybody runs on the same ticket. We don't have primaries here anymore in the classical sense where parties choose their own candidates. Everybody runs, and the 2 top vote getters run off in November, and they can both be in the same party, and they actually often are. And that is thought to be a solid possibility this time around, but not a certainty, with Steve Garvey seeming to take a lot of the vote. I believe his other opponents are all in the single digits of support in the latest poll, but he's in double digits and slightly behind Katie Porter, and the one who is in first place is Adam Schiff, but he is but he's in the 20s in the polls, certainly not dominating anything. And then there is Barbara Lee, who I believe in the last poll was at about 9%. She's in 4th place. Can she slip in and pull ahead of Porter and Garvey? Who knows? But a lot going on here. There's been at least one debate that I know of. Garvey, I think it is not that he might not become a better candidate, but he didn't really perform well. He looked like he was in over his head. A lot of Republicans will still vote for him anyway. As we've discussed, he was part of that great LA Dodgers infield. That's points against me because I was a Giants fan in the 1970s, but he was great, a great baseball player. So naturally, as a lot of people think, well, since I was a great baseball player, maybe I'll make a great senator. So he's running, and he does appear to be gathering the most support of any of the Republicans. So we've talked before about what happened at the Democratic nominating convention where Barbara Lee won, but she's not winning in the polls, at least not yet. And so, the question is does she have a chance to come in second? Of course, we always say she has a chance, but what are the likelihoods? And will it be a all Democrat runoff in November with either Barbara Lee or Katie Porter? It does seem pretty certain at this point that Adam Schiff, who seems to be the party insider favorite, and does seem to have the most votes. A lot of people were happy with what he did around January 6th and the impeachments and the like. But it would be interesting to see what happens if he goes up against Katie Porter. And I want to talk, or Barbara Lee, and I want to talk a little bit about why I think it's not necessarily guaranteed that Adam Schiff, who is the more conservative or the least liberal of the 3, might not fare all that well with Republicans in the general, even though he's more conservative. So I want to talk about that, but I want to invite you to talk about what you think about this race, what's happening, and where it's going.
Well, thank you for that setup. That was comprehensive. So big picture, it's been reported through the changes in polling outcomes over the last few weeks and months, that there's been a degree of support consolidating around Adam Schiff, and he's actually increasing his lead over the field. Similarly, there's been an increased amount of Republican support consolidating around Garvey. When you add up everybody that's gotten any kind of results, it's, there's like a core 4, Schiff, Garvey, and then also the 2 Democrats, Katie Porter and Barbara Lee. Everyone else is in, low single digits, but still you get to about 70%. So the field is wide open in the sense that there's basically more undecideds than there are decideds, than any single decided candidate rather.
Right.
So there's a lot still in play, and that's big picture. So that's 30,000 feet. But realistically, number one, Schiff currently, depending on which polling you're looking at, I'm kind of skimming through it right now. Schiff's at about 25% and Garvey's at about 18%, both for them. Those are both high watermarks. Whereas Katie Porter's, been bouncing around between, say, 13 and 17, and now she's kind of at a low point a little bit for her for the recent past. Barbara Lee has been kind of steady in the high single digits, 8, 9, with not many changes. So what does that mean? That means that there's a really good chance that the runoff will be between Schiff and Garvey. Now, if you were to combine the two progressives, Porter and Lee, then yes, there'd be a chance, I think a high chance actually, that it would be Schiff as an establishment Democrat against, either Katie Porter or Barbara Lee as the progressive Democrat. But right now, we're not really seeing that. So that's one thing to be aware of. That's a significant thing to be aware of. The last thing I'll add is I saw this kind of left field poll result that I'm just going to throw out there because it's not clear how this is going to play out. But if you combined, if the combined progressive support was behind the candidate which is getting the most there, which is Katie Porter, if you added her, if it was Porter versus Schiff head to head, Porter is ahead by over 10 points. So in a perfect world, if Katie Porter for Katie Porter, I guess, in a perfect world for Katie Porter, she'd be in the lead and would have the advantage against the establishment candidate. What that means for me is that as of now, in the state of California, where it's about 2-1 Republicans to Democrats to Republicans, Republicans have a pretty big lane, and Garvey may be the spoiler that prevents Porter and Lee from participating in the general.
Yeah, he definitely he could do it, but he's got a couple of problems. One of them is he's refused to pledge to support Trump. To endorse Trump in 2024. And he differs from Trump on a few issues, and it's being coaxed out of him in these. So if he had the full Republican support, there's no doubt that he would come in number 2. There's too much division between the Democratic candidates. But are they going to vote for him, or are they going to vote for one of the others? Who have, as you say, have fallen behind, but you combine their votes and they're not all that different from his, right? And so it's, so he's got that problem. There are a lot of people who will just vote for him because he got the R. Maybe they won't have heard about his statement. If I was Katie Porter and Barbara Lee, I'd be advertising that fact that Steve Garvey is refusing to support Trump. Hey, what do you think about that, right, red staters? So because that would be cutting in to any possibility. But Schiff doesn't want it. He wants to run against the Republican, right? He wants Garvey in there because Garvey, I'm just going to say it, doesn't have a chance against Schiff. Schiff would bury him. And the rest, whereas Katie Porter, I'm just going to put this out there, Adam Schiff is probably the least liberal of the 3 candidates, definitely the least liberal of the 3 candidates. So typically speaking, when that happens, Dianne Feinstein, when she had the councilman from Los Angeles, I'm forgetting his name. He got into a brawl recently, probably ended his political career, but he was the progressive candidate. And Republicans voted for her because they want, if they can't have a conservative candidate, then they want to have a moderate, right? Or a less liberal candidate. But Adam Schiff plays a special role in the minds of people voting for Trump. And we know the Trump voters are going to be out. So who will they vote for? Maybe they'll just skip the Senate part of the ticket altogether. And a lot of them probably will do that. But will they vote for Katie Porter to basically because they don't like what Schiff did to Trump? I don't know. I don't know if that will be a factor. I don't know how deeply all of the voters think about these things, but it would, would it give Katie Porter or Barbara Lee the chance? Kevin De Leon, yes, that was the candidate who is probably not going to be in politics much longer, but we don't want to talk about that today.
So I'll pick up on where you left off here, which is, and I'll just give an anecdote here because I'm gonna talk a little bit about the actual debate. But in that debate, Steve Garvey was, I would say he was attempting to be professorial, but in the sense of like your great uncle or something. He was talking very slow. He was talking very deliberately. He didn't want to be, pigeonholed or buttoned down. He misspoke on some policy issues. I think he proved himself that he's not a politician, and he's not ashamed of that. But one of the zingers that Katie Porter gave him said, once a Dodger, always a Dodger, which was actually really funny because he was dodging the question about his support for Trump.
That's a great line. She's good at that.
Yeah. So with that in mind, if you're not.
If he was smart, he laughed at it. Yeah. I don't know whether he did. Did he?
Yeah. I guess it was funny. Everybody laughed. Yeah. But so my point here is that like, if he's not going to be outward, strongly supporting Trump, then he runs the risk of people just not voting for him on that line item and not wanting to give him support. But so he was lingering in around 10% for a while, but now he's gotten, much, now he's up to about 18. Not to put too much credence in the horse race, but the question is, are people going to stay home or not? Are people going to skip that line or not? Certainly he didn't do himself any favors from a policy perspective, from a leadership perspective, from a viable candidate perspective. When he was on the big stage, I don't think he got much support from his effort.
Right.
So I think the jury's still out on that. But
my question is,
go ahead.
Again, before we run out of time, would Porter benefit? Would she actually receive MAGA votes who just want to spite Schiff?
Maybe, yes. I guess you're right. There's that sort of gaming of the outcome. If it were Katie Porter, as a way to get back at Schiff, then maybe. But I don't know. I don't see that, as like what would actually happen. If it was Schiff versus Porter, I think some people would vote against Schiff by voting for Porter. I guess that's in the general, for example. And we see that play out. She's got an over 10-point lead in a head-to-head, but that's, like I said, that's sort of an outlier poll. But I think, while we still have some time, people complain sometimes, you guys just talk about the horse race. What about the substance? And, despite like you and I mean, I'm not sure how many times I've seen you on these calls, but I know we've had a lot of opportunities to meet with these candidates on the Democratic side, and there's some differentiation between them that's robust. And progressives really love and respect Barbara Lee's track record, her history, all of her accomplishments over decades, and so that speaks for itself.
Vote against the Afghan war, only candidate explicitly calling for a ceasefire.
But when it came to performance, like I already told you my take on Garvey, that's sort of my take on Barbara Lee. I don't think that she necessarily exhibited any kind of that charisma that people might want to get behind. Versus, Schiff and Porter, they were both like extremely articulate, finesse. I say Schiff was a little bit more smooth, and Katie Porter was more sharp, witty, bold. And so there were definitely different styles. But I could see how possibly people would say, okay, like realistically, do we want to go for Schiff, who's the guy who led the January 6th committee and fighting against Trump's all the problems that he had, the troubles, and also the Russian involvement and the anti-democratic nature of what the potential is for a Trump presidency. Schiff is sort of like the MSNBC icon for those folks.
Yes.
But really, Katie Porter has her own lane that she's created herself. I mean, she's professorial in a way that is like she boils it down to simplicity. She's authoritative. I don't mean professorial.
Right.
I mean authoritative.
Famous for the whiteboard. That's
whiteboard. She rocks it, and there's a lot of people out there that are like, that's probably what we need. So I think there's this lane for people saying we probably need Barbara Lee, but there are some people out there saying we probably need Katie Porter. I don't think too many people are saying we need Adam Schiff. I think what people say is we're going to get him. We might as well support him.
I mean, Katie Porter is considered to be somewhat to the left of Schiff, and she has won in. It's especially difficult for a Democrat to win now, but even before she won in a very purple state, district. I mean, she knows how to talk to everybody, and that could also be her strength in the general. But as you say, we've got the substance of it. I mean, what are the substantive differences? Well, we know the ceasefire is it. Now, Katie Porter and Adam Schiff haven't said they oppose the ceasefire. They've just been silent on the issue, and Barbara Lee that's probably what helped her win the most votes in the Democratic Party nominating convention.
Yeah, and we're seeing it play out. It's not the public. And I agree with you on that. And to be fair, speaking about ceasefire, speaking about the Middle East is a really thankless task for people. But when you want to be a senator, you really ought to have a grasp of it, wrap your head around it, meet your constituents where they are. And it's questionable how many people really want, I guess it's not that questionable. About 70% of people polled nationwide want something different than what we've got right now. Yeah. And what we've got right now is this unconditional, uncritical support. So I think that rope is fraying a little bit. And, but it puts Barbara Lee in a superior position here to speak to the humanitarian needs. More importantly, people say any war that's ever ended has ended by peace. So diplomacy. So investing in diplomacy. Speaking about diplomacy, we're only seeing that from Barbara Lee for the most part. Everybody else is really keeping quiet.
Eeny, meeny, chili beanie. The spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
This brings us to the final segment of our show, predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
I'm going to keep it real simple today and just pick up where we left off on the California senatorial race. I really think that the evidence indicates that we will probably see an Adam Schiff versus Steve Garvey race, and that Adam Schiff, the numbers are in his favor, and that he'll end up the two of them in the general, and with Adam Schiff being the next senator from California.
Okay, I'm going to counter you on that. I'm going to say that it's going to be Adam Schiff and Katie Porter, because I believe if Barbara Lee doesn't start making a move in polls, a lot of the progressives who have supported Barbara Lee will move to Katie Porter. We're a split household in that. I support Barbara Lee. Right now, my wife has moved to Katie Porter, saying we got to have her in there. So based on that and some other evidence, I actually think it's more likely to be a Democratic runoff in November, but we'll see. We'll be covering it over the next few weeks. We'll probably discuss it again the week before the election. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.